I would now like to introduce you all to our next session, in their own words, Understanding Lashkar-e-Tayyaba. The panel is based on the book by C. Christine Fehm, who's a Provost Distinguished Associate Professor in the Security Studies program within the Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. She previously served as a political officer with the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan and Kabul, and a senior research associate at the United States Institute for Peace. We are joined at this session by Barkha Dutt as a moderator. She's an award-winning TV journalist and anchor with more than 2 decades of reporting experience. She emerged as a prominent figure after her frontline war reporting on the Kargil conflict between India and Pakistan in 1999. Barkha is a recipient of many national and international awards for her work, including the Padma Shri, India's 4th highest civilian honor. The panelists, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to them, they are Hilal Ahmed, who is Associate Professor at CSTS and Associate Editor of South Asian Studies, Journal of the British Association of South Asian Studies. He works in political Islam, Muslim politics of representation, and politics of symbols in South Asia. Max Rodenbeck, who studied at the American University in Cairo, where he received a degree in Islamic history. He began his career as a journalist in the Middle East, writing for numerous publications, including the Financial Times, The Economist, the Los Angeles Times, Foreign Affairs, and the New York Review of Books. In 2000, he became a staff writer for The Economist and for 15 years served as its Middle East bureau chief. Since 2016, he has been on the paper's South Asia Bureau. Shekhar Gupta, who's a recipient of the Padma Bhushan and is also the founder and editor-in-chief of The Print, he is a prolific columnist with the highly influential column National Interest, which is translated into 7 languages, and a collection of which became the best-selling book Anticipating India. He also hosts Off the Cuff, an offering from The Print, and Walk the Talk on NDTV 24/7 every week. In his 4-decade-long career, Gupta has reported on several key Indian and international events. Over to the chair.
There's Christine. I was wondering where the author was. Yeah, I was wondering where the author was. Okay. We're now going to shift our focus to the Lashkar-e-Tayyaba. I think most of us in this room, even those of us who do not follow India-Pakistan or strategy and security affairs issues, every Indian possibly today, for all the wrong reasons, is familiar when you say LET or Lashkar. We associate it above everything with the Mumbai attacks, 26/11, which really did finally put Lashkar on the global stage and got people in Washington to wake up from their slumber. But interestingly, while many of us may imagine the Lashkar to be one of many terrorist organizations that are operating from Pakistani soil, all through the same sort of ideological prism with the same aim, in this remarkable book that Christine has actually written and researched, putting together a lot of literature that belongs to the Lashkar-e-Tayyaba itself, she describes the LET to be the most coherent terror organization run from Pakistan and the one that the Pakistani deep state has the most control over. She also makes a fascinating distinction between why the Lashkar is truly a strategic asset for the Pakistani state in a way that other Islamist terror groups that are operating from Pakistani soil are not, in particular because the Lashkar is the only terror group, according to Christine Fair, that never actually turns its terror on so-called infidels or kafirs. There is no violence that the Pakistani or the Pakistani state has to fear from the Lashkar-e-Tayyaba. And this is a painstaking sort of documentation of the patronage of the ISI of the Lashkar, the Lashkar's many avatars, it moving from the LET, a terror group, to the front organization, the Jamaat-ul-Dawa, that gains respectability by doing massive relief work, and then its latest avatar as a political party, which didn't do very well in the last elections, but as you can see, it keeps climbing up the credibility ladder where it keeps getting whitewashed into more and more acceptable templates. The format today We're going to ask Christine to speak a little bit on her book, and then I'm just going to ask the speakers to speak for just a couple of minutes. I think we can avoid long speeches so we can keep this interactive and conversational. But Christine, it's over to you to just first introduce your book to us.
Right. Is this thing on?
Yes.
Well, first, thanks to OUP and all of you for participating in this. This is the first time I've participated in this conclave, and it's really an honor. Really?
Yeah, why don't you take this? Maybe it's just a mic thing.
Is this any better? Oh my goodness, yes it is. So first I want to thank OUP and all of you for being here, and I'm sorry that I was detained in a discussion. I didn't even realize that my fellow panelists had come up here. So I guess that makes me a classic academic of being clueless. All right, so I'm going to talk about what my book isn't. There are a lot of books that talk about what Lashkar-e-Tayyaba does, particularly in India and of course in the last decade or so also in Afghanistan. This book isn't about what Lashkar does. It's about what Lashkar says it is. It's about the domestic politics of the organization with a particular focus upon what this organization does within Pakistan itself. So if you're looking for a book that basically rehearses everything that Stephen Tankle says, this book is not going to be for you. But if you want to understand how the organization represents itself and to Pakistanis and to its handlers, then this is the book for you. So what I'm going to talk about here, for the most part, I would say that the two core kinds of arguments that I make in the book is that Lashkar is not only useful to Pakistan because it is a very lethal and disciplined killing organization abroad, and it doesn't kill within Pakistan. Now, Jaish-e-Mohammed is a similar organization, but Jaish is like an onion, right? Pieces peel off of Jaish and go to Lashkar-e-Jhangvi or to Sipe-Sabe, Pakistan. Other pieces of the onion come off and join the Pakistani Taliban. And that's because Jaish, like many of these other organizations, where individuals move relatively freely, it's a Deobandi organization, and there are many Deobandi terrorist organizations in Pakistan, and obviously the Afghan Taliban itself is a Deobandi organization. So you'll never really know if a person in Jaish, today he is a good jihadi, and tomorrow he might be a terrorist. But for the most part, at the level of the individual, the deep state never has to worry about this when it comes to Lashkar-e-Tayyaba. So that's one reason why this organization is so useful to the state. It's a disciplined killer. But the second reason is that it plays an incredibly important role on the domestic politics within Pakistan. And let me unpack this very briefly. So I think in the terrorism studies industry, of which I am a member, there is a tendency to fail to distinguish these different groups from each other. And you'll know if I'm a reviewer of your paper because I will say, no, Salafis aren't the ones blowing up stuff in Pakistan. They are Deobandis and they're not Salafis. So over the years, and I think this comes out of my training, not as a political scientist, frankly. My PhD is in South Asian languages and civilization. So I come at this from a very different point of view, privileging texts. And when you live in their texts, you get a very deep appreciation of how these different groups market themselves from other groups. Because at the end of the day, they are competing for influence, they're competing for money, they're competing for patronage, they're basically competing for all the organizational assets that it needs. And so the role that it plays in Pakistan is actually a vigorous opponent to all of these Deobandi groups that I mentioned. They are, in fact, some of you may or may not know this, they are literally at war with ISIS, right? And so when you read their publication, I think you get and by the way, Oxford, when it's done, is, inshallah, bringing out the companion to this book, which is an edited translation of all of the major documents that I use in this book. So you'll have a chance to see some of the documents that I use here. But I think the most important document is called Hum Kyun Jihad Kar Rahe Hain? Why are we waging jihad? And by the way, for my friends from the US Embassy who perhaps might have ties to the FBI, this document is great because it actually demonstrates that Hafiz Saeed is the head of this organization and that the jihad that they're doing is actually the violent jihad. So I know the FBI has been interested in evidence for quite some while. Every once in a while I toss some evidence out. No one ever seems to care about that evidence, but that's an aside. This is an important piece of evidence because this piece, which has the imprimatur of Hafiz Saeed, talks specifically about who they kill, why they kill them, and the conditions under which they kill. And most of this document is, well, it's told like this Socratic style. There's an aspiring jihadi, he's asking an older, wise jihadi, and the first question is, when Pakistan is so corrupt, when Pakistan itself is not an Islami riyasat, an Islamic state, why are we doing jihad in Kashmir? This makes no sense. Good question. The rest of the document spend time explaining why we don't kill people in Pakistan. I'm from Indiana. I have an off-color sense of humor. Is my mother would say, we do not micturate in our own bathtub. That's probably not the word my mom would use, peace be upon her, but much of the 35 pages comes down to that, right? We do not soil the place where we eat and sleep, and we do not irritate our patrons, because the most important thing that Lashkar-e-Tayyaba has is access to the state itself. So the vast majority of this book describes why, no matter how terrible Pakistani Muslims may be, you cannot kill them. And they have this concept of kalima go, someone who has said the kalima. They cannot be killed for the simple reason that even on a bad day, you know, maybe they're like Epstein and they're serial pederasts. On their worst day, on the day of their most sinful conduct, they still recognize Allah as the preeminent power in the universe. And for this reason, we cannot kill them. We can only subject them to preaching, right, which is what dawa means, and we can invite them to jihad. And they have a taxonomy of different kinds of sinners who ultimately are Muslim. They talk about Barelvis. Barelvis are particularly problematic because JUD, Lashkar-e-Tayyaba, it is a Salafi organization. They talk a lot about Wahid, this notion of unity. And Barelvis violate this notion because they equate attributes of Allah to the Prophet. That even on a bad day, no matter how angry you are with these Barelvis, you cannot kill them. You can only instruct them on how to be better Muslims. Deobandis also irritate Lashkar-e-Tayyaba. So for those of you who have a military background, you might see members of Jaish or Lashkar perhaps coordinating logistically. You may even see them doing some sort of coordinated operations together, right? But at the level of ideology, they're absolute foes. And the reason for this is Deobandis practice takfir. Lashkar-e-Tayyaba is vehemently opposed to takfir, which is this process of declaring a Muslim to be a kafir and therefore wajibul qatl, right? So if you actually look at some of this literature, it's actually kind of funny, right? Because what Islamic State will say, Lashkar, they're not real jihadis. They're a bunch of patsies of the ISI, and they don't do takfir. And then Lashkar will respond, oh yeah, you don't think we're real jihadis? Well, let me tell you this. We could do takfir, but our standards of evidence and jurisprudence are just so much better than yours that we're actually like the real takfiris because we know how to do it right. So you'll see these really bizarre arguments going back and forth. But why is this important to the Pakistani state, right? It's ironically the Deobandis, which the Pakistanis have patronized in Afghanistan, the Afghan Taliban, Jaish al-Mohammed. It has a very ambivalent relationship with Lashkar-e-Jhangvi and Sipe-Sabe Pakistan. So the irony is Pakistan has made very heavy use of Deobandis, but it is the backlash of Deobandis which is actually killing Pakistanis, right? The only terrorist groups killing Pakistanis today are Deobandis, right? Lashkar's not doing it. The groups associated with Jamaat Islami, they're not doing it. It's their Deobandis. So this is the way in which the Pakistani state is able to put some sort of both an ideological as well as an operational quarantine around these groups that the state has so heavily relied upon. And in fact, when they floated the Milli Muslim League, and I'm actually convinced Lashkar didn't want to do this. I think the ISI made them do it. One of the things I loved about this election was that for the first time, the deep state, they were really on a back foot. I mean, they have such a slender bench of people that they can rotate in and out of the PMO office, and so they're like, crap, we got to reinvent a party. Let's get on to this, fut. So I think this might actually be a long-term project in the same way that Zia, right, created Nawaz Sharif. And I also think they're going to fail. I also think that over the long term, this is bad news for the organization, which is why they're not so enthusiastic about it. But basically, when the ISI says march the tune of my kazoo, and the kazoo blows, these guys are going to start marching. But to give you a sense of how important and interconnected these organizations are, the fellow who was basically the media management guy of the MML, he did his thesis at Pakistan's National Defense University. And his thesis was on why the Jamaat al-Dawa is the only organization that's capable of defeating ISIS in Pakistan. By the way, you can go and get this thesis. It's really fascinating, it's incredibly sophisticated, and I think it is perhaps the most significant document that doesn't come out of Dar al-Andalus. Let me know when you want me to shut up. You're going to tell me. Okay. It's the only document that doesn't come out of Dar al-Andalus, which is the singular publishing house of Lashkar-e-Tayyaba, that lays out these internal conflicts. So when you understand that this is the only organization in Pakistan trying to quarantine these Deobandis murdering Pakistan, a lot of other things suddenly makes a lot of sense. And in fact, this was my first question when I began this research now back in 1995, when I was a student collecting their materials. Why does this organization despite all of the pressure that the Pakistanis get to shut them down, why do they continue to basically tell the international community to bugger off? It's because of this domestic utility, right? And so when Pakistan, when there's, for example, a natural disaster in Balochistan, the Pakistanis will not let international NGOs go in there, right? It is Jamaat al-Dawa, Falah Insaniyat Foundation, the Falah Insaniyat Foundation go to Balochistan because they want Pakistanis to see this organization helping them. And at the same time, they are spreading their message. Hafiz Saeed has said repeatedly that they're the only organization that can solve the Balochistan crisis. In Sindh, one of the most growth-oriented places for this organization. Why? That's where a lot of Hindus live. You read their publications, they're not allowed to kill Hindus in Pakistan. In India, Afghanistan, it's open season, but not in Pakistan. So what you'll see them doing in Sindh, they'll be reaching out, they'll be building wells, because there's a very significant precarity arising from water shortage. They're providing medical services to the Hindu community. Now, why is the government not doing that? Again, Lashkar's approach is to one by one bring them into the fold, not just of Islam, but Lashkar's kind of Islam. So the other project, the other part of the book, apart from unpacking the domestic politics of the organization, is really drawing upon this massive database that I have of 800 or so of these militants, or terrorists, whatever you want to call them. Different audiences have different political equities around the nomenclature. But that's the other major strand, is talking about who are the members of this organization, what motivates them to join, and how do they differ from the ways in which we're told. I don't think I have time to go into that, but if there's questions about that in the Q&A, I'm happy to do so. And this is going to form the next large project that I have on this organization, which is really the battlefield motivation of these guys. What do we learn about why these guys are fighting? And a little bit, like a 10-second summary, they're not from madrasas, right? These are, in fact, some of Pakistan's most well-educated young men. You will not see once in my book the word radicalization. I depart from many of my colleagues in the terrorism industry because I don't agree with this word. If we're not willing to say that the US Army radicalized both of my brothers at the age of 16, We shouldn't use that word here. Now, if we're all happy using that word radicalize in both of these spheres, cool, let's do it. But when I am reading their materials, and for those of you who don't know it, I spent many, many years at the RAND Corporation working on military manpower. I see this organization behaving like any other military organization. It's literally manning a mission. And I think that's part of the reason why you see such high human capital attributes amongst these fighters, is because in general, and this is the last point, in general, LET, they're not going into a shrine and doing suicide attacks, right? They don't do suicide attacks at all. They actually do high-risk missions. So from the Pakistan Army's point of view, they are basically getting a soldier with a firing power somewhere between someone who could have joined the Pakistan Military Academy and become an officer and an NCO, right? But they're doing this at the fraction of a price, right? So which is another reason I argue in the book why this organization is so important to the Pakistanis. You know from your own budget, the vast majority of your budget goes to take care of the perquisites of serving and retired officers, right? You don't have to worry about that with these guys, right? But they're almost as competent as a group of special operators, and you're doing it for virtually nothing. Anyways, I'm going to shut up there. I could keep talking.
We'll have lots to ask you, Christine. Thank you. I think that was absolutely fascinating. And actually, one of the very compelling and revelatory points in this is, we often say Fidain attack in the Kashmir Valley, and Fidain is used interchangeably with suicide attacks. And Christine documents how these are terrorists who do not go in to die. The motto is rather, it's better to be killed than to be taken alive. And that is really, in that sense, a militaristic response to violence. Max, I'm just going to ask you to come in for a couple of minutes.
Sure. Is that working? Oh, yeah. Thanks very much, Barker. Just wanted to start by saying how jealous I am of Christine, who has been labeled by according to your introduction, I believe it too, has been labeled by the ISI, the Inter-Services Intelligence in Pakistan, as a nasty woman. I mean, this is a title that I really wish I could achieve that level of notoriety, I suppose. And I'd like to congratulate Christine on a really very useful book. I mean, it's a beautifully researched book and extremely clear, and it's a great addition to sort of the knowledge about terrorism. I mean, it does a lot of things. In the ways that it adds to our knowledge are multiple. I mean, the way that you explore how close Lashkar-e-Tayyaba is to the state is quite interesting, backed up by a lot of data and facts. There's a very interesting page that runs through, for example, how much of the state budget of Punjab, for example, national budget, has been allocated to projects and institutions that are directly related to Lashkar-e-Tayyiba. And these are fairly large sums of money. And this is published information, it's not hidden from view. And some of it was given at times when Lashkar-e-Tayyiba was actually officially proscribed. So it's pretty straightforward. So that's very useful. And you've got other extremely useful data, for example, about the combatants, as you were mentioning. Who are these people? Where do they come from? And it's quite revelatory, some of what you've discovered. They do not fit the profile that is generally ascribed to these kinds of militants. So that's actually extremely useful. Something else that you've got in there, which I thought was excellent, was a large section about the relationship of this group with women. The families of women, mothers of martyrs, etc., and actually how important this relationship is to recruitment and so on. That's a really unique contribution. I haven't seen that in other places, and I thought that was excellent. Yeah, and particularly, I think, as Barka mentioned as well, you put in context the relationship between the military aspects of Lashkar-e-Tayyiba and its domestic function. And I think it's really interesting. I mean, some of the just numbers tell you a lot. I mean, you mentioned at one point that the estimated budget is around $50 million, something like that a year, according to one estimate, of which only 2.5 million is devoted to jihad activities, which is about 5%. I mean, these are obviously very vague numbers, but I mean, it just gives a quick indication of the actual focus of these groups, which is not, as one often believes, single-mindedly on jihad, but actually has much wider repercussions. So I think that's very important. And lastly, I think you also put in focus very, very well you situate Lashkar-e-Tayyiba very well within a much wider ideological spectrum. and show how important that is. I mean, you know, the fact that it is an outgrowth of the Ahl al-Hadith movement, which is actually a very small part of Sunni Islam, of the Sunni sort of spectrum. And in Pakistan only represents about 4% of the population. So it doesn't actually draw on a very deep bench, as you say. I'll just conclude with a couple of queries, though, which is, I think, I slightly wonder, and perhaps this is the journalist speaking as opposed to the academic, if some of this is a little bit dated. I mean, Lashkar-e-Tayyaba, if you look at its more than 200 terrorist attacks in the last 20 years, perhaps 180 of those predate the last decade. I mean, up to 2010, very, very active. Since 2010, not very active, and certainly on the Indian front. It's been almost completely replaced by other groups. So that's a question. Is this slightly out of date? And when we talk about estimates of how much money they have or what their publications are, a lot of the information there is a little bit old. And I wonder if that could be, you know, if we can sort of now speak of the current moment a bit more. And the other thing is how you know, whether there is actually a change in, I mean, you're very, very firm in your condemnation of Pakistan's, you know, use of these groups over time, and absolutely justified in that. But I just wonder if we get too caught up in that and don't notice when things do change. I mean, you know, just in the last year, as you know, is in the newspaper this morning, the number of infiltrations in India into India has dropped to 0 in the last season, which suggests perhaps better Indian, you know, defense, but also a change in Pakistani tactics. And I wonder if we're not giving enough credit to potential change in Pakistan. And also to the fact that these groups have really never, no matter what their relationship to the deep state, I mean, they have never really taken off in a big way inside Pakistan either. I mean, in the last election, 2018, the political party that was actually associated with Lashkar-e-Tayyaba, and perhaps unwillingly, as you say, that's a very possible explanation. But they actually, their tally of votes was less than 0.2%. They didn't win a single seat, either nationally or in state assemblies, none. And in fact, all of the Islamic groups put together, including much more moderate ones, got less than 5% of the vote. So I think this has to be taken in context, and that's just a comment, not a criticism, but more, you know, perhaps we can discuss.
Okay, we'll park those questions for when we actually get into the discussion. And there is also an interesting shift, Christine, as you know, taking place in the Kashmir Valley, where Lashkar was the predominant terror group with the Pakistani state, clearly pushing the Jaish above the Lashkar, and we can talk a little bit about why that's happening. But
you know, I actually wrote that. I was the first person to actually say, Jaish is going to be overtaking this.
Yes, so that has happened. You were prophetic, but we need to understand why. But I'll just first get Hilal into the conversation to talk a little bit about your observations and the very interesting sort of calling out by Christine on the lazy interchangeability that people, you know, every time there is Islamist violence described, there's a shorthand, people say it's Salafi. I think Christine makes that very, very clear distinction, Hilal. So if you just want to come in on that.
This is a provocative book, and I thought that it requires a systematic response. So I'll come to the question which you raised later, but I would like to read a few things which I find it very, very persuasive from my own point of view, because I work on Muslim politics in India. There can be two ways to engage with this book. The first possibility is to travel with the author simply by following the question she identifies, the sources she discovers, and the argument she makes. This mode of reading, in my view, is certainly crucial to understand the enigmatic yet visibly disturbing entity called Lashkar-e-Tayyaba, or Army of the Poor. However, there is another and more nuanced possibility to read this book. We may read this Pakistani-centric story of Lashkar-e-Tayyaba to extract a framework which could help us in understanding the placing of religion and religiosity in the South Asian politics. And that's the larger point which I'm trying to underline. As a reader, I feel one must employ both of these interpretive strategies. This is what I propose to do. Broadly speaking, the book, and I'm just, because you know, when you were introducing your book, you're picking and choosing a few things. What I'm going to do is to provide a systematic narrative of the book, and then that will help us in responding to the book in a rather more informed manner. In my view, broadly speaking, the book introduced us to three sets of questions. The first set of questions are institution-oriented. LET's strategic relationship with Pakistani state, which he calls deep state. The role of Pakistani army in providing legitimacy to LET. And above all, LET's own organizational apparatus are identified as important theoretical concern. However, the book makes a serious analytical move and asks a few conceptual issues about the much discussed notion of what is often called the ideology of Pakistan. Third set of questions is about the reformulation of Islamic principles, especially Tawheed and Jihad, in constituting a politically favorable religiosity in contemporary Pakistan, and this is a question which you were referring to. These questions are systematically explored by employing a creatively worked out mixed method. The author identifies two sets of material as her primary sources, which she mentioned. Books and pamphlets published by the official wing of Lashkar-e-Tayyaba. And the second is, which is very interesting, the Shaheed biographies, which offers life stories of those activists of Lashkar-e-Tayyaba who died in various operations in India as well as in Afghanistan. On the basis of a close and critical examination of these sources, the author makes two very powerful claims. First, it is argued that LET is an outcome of the ideology of Pakistan, which relies on two inseparable elements. A, the two-nation theory, and B, the adherence to Islamic identity of the Muslim of Pakistan. The Pakistani establishment, the government, army, and the bureaucracy seems to evoke the two-nation theory to articulate various nationalistic imagination of Islamic identity of the people of Pakistan. However, LET has been probably the most dominant political entity which invokes its interpretation of Islam to redefine the two-nation theory itself. So it's the other way around. LET's version of Islam, and she identifies in two very interesting chapters, talks about Muslim and non-Muslims. The Muslims are, and you were rightly pointed out, Kalma Go, as the one who recite and adheres to the basic principle of Islam, and by this logic, all Muslim citizens of Pakistan emerge as religious political community, while the non-Muslim, including Ahmadiyas, are strategically excluded. The enemies of Islam are the Kafirs, especially the Hindus of India, and they are defined as the main opponent in the struggle for this jihad. And finally, the jihad is conceptualized as a way out to liberate Hindu or India unoccupied Kashmir. Since the reworked imagination of Islam is confined within the realm of two-nation theory, it does not answer, the literature which she cited, does not answer two very fundamental questions. The first question is, why is the jihad not applicable in Pakistan? And the second question is, what to do with Muslims in India, especially outside Kashmir? Are they not sufficiently Islamic? These are the questions which she asks us to think about. The second main claim of the book is equally persuasive. It argues that the LET is placed strategically to create a viable ideological equilibrium in the domestic politics of Pakistan. At the same time, the Pakistani state employed LET as a proxy to intervene in Kashmir. This brings me to the second possible interpretative strategy, which I wish to sketch briefly here. The book, in my view, offers us a framework to understand the obsession of post-colonial South Asian state with European idea of nation-state, especially in post-Cold War world. More specifically, three aspects of this framework may be underlined as reasonable questions. The first question which I posed is, how does the post-colonial state conceptualize the official religiosity by drawing upon a variety of sources so as to justify its version of nationalism, and this is applicable in the present-day India as well. The second facet of this framework is, how does the state create possibility for the emergence as well as consolidation of what Fayers calls proxies to survive? And finally, how does the nuances of domestic politics define the changing contour of foreign policy? Following this framework, I think an Indian story of this kind is possible and desirable. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilal. I think that was very, very interesting. And just on your last point, what about the Muslims outside of Kashmir who live in India? I think that is perhaps why Christine does not use the word radicalization, and it is the indoctrination. Yes, but is Islam a mere instrument as opposed to the central driving force? I think that's at the heart actually of this debate. Shekhar, I want you to come in on. There's a chapter in the book about Pakistan's nuclear coercion. And to Max's point, have things shifted and are shifting even since the publication of this book? Has Balakot changed that? Do the old rules apply? If every terror strike is going to see a potential retaliation, can the Pakistani state continue to ignore the global pressure or the condemnation of the Lashkar-e-Tayyaba if it is identified by the Indian state as the terror organization that is anathema to us?
Well, first I'll try and answer your question, and then some questions and some compliments for Dr. Fair. I heard this in the previous session that so many terror attacks and ceasefire violations have not led to escalation. I think that analysis is very outdated now. Remember the line that, was it Armitage, that who spoke to the ISI, visiting ISI chief after 9/11, when the visiting ISI chief said there is a history to Kashmir, and he said history begins today. So history on Indo-Pakistan relations has begun again on Feb 26, 2019, like it or not. Every major attack in India, and major will be defined depending on the politics of the day in India, depending on the mood of the day in India, every major attack in India will have a swift, clear retaliation, unmindful of the risks, and unmindful of escalation. I think that is now set. Nobody should have any doubts. Anybody who has those doubts, I'm sorry, is intellectually lazy. And if in Pakistan anybody has that doubt, he's an idiot, but Pakistan is not short of them, right? Because Pakistanis don't always think from their heads. Pakistanis have a very tactical thinking. They have brilliant tactical thinking, but they have very poor strategic thinking. If that wasn't the case, they would not have lost 60% of the country, and they would not have even less of Kashmir that they had in 1947. It's a country where run by tactical thinking of losers. So once again, a miscalculation is possible, and if it happens, so be it, right? My editorial views will not matter. We can write our sanctimonious editorials or whatever, they will not matter one bit. And you can have 55 Aman ki Ashas, but there will be a swift retaliation to everything. And next time, it will be more demonstrable than it was in Balakot. So that's one. And I think there is some realization on the Pakistani side. And once again, Pakistanis are trying to be too clever by half. Dr. Fair talked about, in fact, I was going to ask you, and I'm asking you, why did you think Pakistanis will now supplant Lashkar with Jaish? My own theory on that, without your scholarship, we journalists rely on scholars. We go to them for quotes and to say, Professor so-and-so says so, but now we have come to a time when we theorize first, and then we wait for scholars to bring us vindication. So your book brings us some vindication I will talk about. But could it be that with, you remember the line that Oliver North invented during the Iran-Contra hearings, plausible deniability? Could it be that Jaish-e-Mohammed gives Pakistani army and ISI plausible deniability? Oh, these guys kill us also. Do you know one of them tried to kill General Musharraf also? He's in our jail, right? They are bad guys for you, bad guys for us. It's a common threat. With Lashkar-e-Tayyaba, no such plausible deniability is available. Now, the reason I said that this book, people like journalists like us can claim sort of retrospective vindication, which is reversing the academic-journalist relationship, that I've been saying it since 2001, that Lashkar-e-Tayyaba is a regiment of the Pakistani Army Special Forces in Mufti. It is run at a very low cost. It's run mainly with volunteers, as you said, with no pensions, no pay commissions. It works out of Pakistani Army campuses. It's a free army. and there is no way India can ever, or any neighbor of Pakistan can ever create something like that. And I do remember the visiting Pakistani, very senior diplomat who used to serve in India, Delhi earlier, and who I had known well. And he had come in with one of the delegations during the talks, during Parakram, and he said to me, you people have no idea, if you start a war now, 200,000 of our nutcases will spill into your countryside in Rajasthan and Gujarat. They'll go to your villages and they'll start slaughtering Hindus. How will you control the communal situation in your country now? So these are well-defined, but again, very tactical. And the real danger to this stability of the subcontinent and the real danger to peace in the subcontinent, until now, I used to say, comes from Pakistani establishments, very short-term tactical thinking. Oh, we shot down an aircraft, they didn't, right? Okay. Now, I would say that tactical thinking is equally matched by a tactical response system here. So, anybody in Pakistan who wants to play this game knows that now UN, FATF, etc. go on, but all that will not matter. There will be a response from India. And India does not have unconventional forces. Whatever the claims, India does not have unconventional assets to carry out punishments in Pakistan. India will have to use conventional forces. So maybe that was a short-term thing. Please tell me if you agree, that they can say, Jash, we have no idea. Now, having said that, second question arising from your book and onwards. Why is it that Pakistani establishment has failed to acquire as much control of the Jash as they've always had of Lashkar? After all, when IC-814 was hijacked and Jash leaders were freed, they were fully in cahoots with the ISI and the Pakistani army. So if there is no gratitude, there are no IOUs, or do we then go into that other theory of Directorate S and then Directorate X, A, B, C, X, Y, Z, which are even more secretive than Directorate S, who don't listen to anybody? So are there deep states within deep states within deep states within deep states? Or is this an elaborate game being played where somebody is still in control?
Okay, I was just looking at the time. We'll talk for about 15, 16 minutes and then keep about 7, 8 minutes for questions. That's how I'm going to time it. So let's keep our responses sharp. We'll start with you, of course, Christine. Let's come to this Jash-Lashkar point, the linkages between them, and speak also to a new strategy. Because after all, we agree that the LET is an instrument of asymmetric warfare by the Pakistani state against India and Kashmir. One of the shifts that Pulwama showed, talking about plausible deniability, is the use of locals in terror attacks. So infiltration down, you use locals, you turn around and say, it isn't us, it's your own people. So you have civilian agitation as your first tier of respectability, and you use only local boys, and you do the linkage to Jash, but in a way that, you know, Pakistan can always turn around and say, he's a boy from Shopian or Sopor, right? How does this change the influence of the Lashkar and its importance to the Pakistani state?
All right, so at the risk of getting really inside baseball, and I don't even like baseball, it is hard to answer this question without getting a little bit nitty-gritty. So some of you know me for a while, and like Praveen Swami, I mean, I had actually been predicting the Pathankot attack as early as 2014. And you have to understand, again, these different organizations. So when Pakistan, the very fact that and everyone does it, the very fact that Jaish is blamed for the attack on Musharraf is why this organization is good. Because that isn't Jaish. The organization that attacked Musharraf was the part of the organization that actually split. So to understand why I say Jaish should have done a Pathankot long before 2014, you have to go back to late December 2001/January 2002. Remember, when the US invaded Afghanistan, our goal was to oust the Taliban. The Taliban at that time was the only emirate of Sharia founded as Deobandis understood Sharia to exist. So Jaish, led by Masood Azhar, at his madrasa in Karachi, they had a huge fight. Most of the organization said, you know, this is complete bakwas, that you want to stay with Musharraf and the ISI. We need to support our brothers. We need to turn against the state. And in fact, the majority of the organization left Masood Azhar. I mean, the dude he basically was left only with the name. They even took over his madrasa. So with just the name of the organization is the only thing left in his pocket, he goes back to Bawalpur and he tells the ISI, dude, I'm sorry, I've lost my men. Now, by the way, the reason why the organization can't control these Deobandis as they can Lashkar is the point that you made, Barka, is that the Deobandis are a much larger percentage of Pakistani's population. By the way, we don't really know the number. They don't ask in the census, and the census is always late anyway, so it would hardly matter. But if we were to look at the archaeological survey data from the Mehek Mawqaf, and we were to look at shrines, and we look at madrasas, what we will see is the Deobandis have actually exploded in Pakistan. And unlike the LA Hadith organizations, the primary LA Hadith organizations in Pakistan oppose Lashkar. They say jihad cannot be waged by a non-state actor. So Lashkar-e-Tayyaba cannot draw from the mosques and the madrasas and the money that they get from mainstream mainstream Salafi organizations in Pakistan, which are already a very small piece of the Islamic business market in Pakistan. In contrast, the most madrasas are coming out of the Deobandi Maslik. They have the mosques, the madrasas, they also have overlapping ties with a Deobandi political party, and they are all together. So they will have resources that will always enable them to do things beyond the will of the deep state. So if you go way back to the early days of the jihad in Kashmir, you'll see the Pakistani state, they were always maneuvering arguments and fissures between Harkatul Ansar, Harkatul Mujahideen, you know, the whole alphabet soup of Deobandis. Because that's the only way the deep state can manage them is by basically dividing and conquering, right? They don't have to do that with Lashkar. And that's why Lashkar is just so much more desirable. It has a smaller base or easier to control. So going back to why were people like me and Praveen Swami expecting a Jaish attack long before Pathankot? This goes back to the internal politics of the Pakistani state, right? The Pakistani Taliban begin in 2007. We know that, and by the way, they began before 2007, but that's when they organized under this banner. The ISI was putting money into Masood Azhar's organization in Bawalpur as early as 2007. I mean, I used to watch the press. I mean, he was building his organization. The Bawalpur police knew about it. Aisha Siddiqa actually should be writing a book about this sometime soon. So, why were they doing this? Because LET is part of the internal antidote to these Deobandis. Also, Jaish-e-Mohammed, and to be a little bit flippant, but I'm not flippant, Jaish-e-Mohammed is a Ghar Wapasi program for Pak Talibs, right? They were given two choices. You can either go back to Jaish and kill Indians and be good terrorists, or you can rejoin the Afghan Taliban. So I was an election observer in 2014. We saw the Pak Talibs, you know, they were being shoved into Afghanistan, and they were being used to manipulate the electoral outcome. My colleagues in the UN saw Jaish lining up along the LOC in 2014. So the reason why you're seeing this swapping out is Lashkar is much more important domestically to the state. And if you're paying attention to what's happening in Pakistan right now, for the first time, the Khaki Kaminas are really dropping loads in their chadis because they do not know how to handle the PTM, right? They can kill every single Baloch to make Balochistan safe for Chinese exploitation, but PTM has them upset, right? Because Pashtuns, they are basically the co-rulers with the Punjabis. They can't simply kill their way out of PTM like they can the Baloch. So this, like I said, this gets really into the nitty-gritty of these organizations. But I anticipate that for the near future, we're going to see much more of Jaish operating here, because that is the way they're keeping these people who are furious with Pakistan from killing Pakistanis.
Okay.
Make sense?
Makes sense. Before I get the others to come in, just to the point raised by Max and Hilal, you know, if the two-nation theory and the reaffirmation of the two-nation theory is at the core of, in a sense, Pakistan's ideology, how does targeting Indian Muslims or Kashmiri Muslims reaffirm that theory? Does it not contradict?
No, it totally doesn't. Because what's good for Pakistanis is not what's good for Indian Muslims, right? I mean, that's what I try to make the point in the book, is that, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Hold the mic closer. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Okay. So in Kashmir, the ISI has a totally different set of problems, right? Because both AQIS and the Islamic State are trying to take that over. So the brilliance of the Pakistani deep state, why they are completely incompetent in so many other ways. Sometimes these guys just nail this, right? Because Jaish, they practice takfir. They are actually the best competitors to Islamic State and AQIS, right? And so if the very fact that you had a local Kashmiri boy at Pulwama and listen to the speech he gave, he is repositioning Jaish to say, AQIS and IS, go bugger off. We've got this. And he also says to the boys, the Kashmiri boys in the north, y'all are a bunch of lafungas. Why are we the ones taking the heat of the jihad? And you know what? They have never done that tape before. There's never been an example of a suicide bomber being Indian and doing a suicide bombing tape, right? This was all about, and I also made an argument, this also had to do with influencing the election, which some people didn't like, but I'm sorry, this is how Pakistan thinks. So it's not a question of...
I mean, you've argued Pakistan wanted Mr. Modi to win again.
Because it really strengthens this two-nation theory argument, and it allows them to just hammer Pashtuns, right? What they're doing against the Pashtuns is completely unprecedented, right? So I view these ideological distinctions actually serve as 2 points. One, trying to retake the initiative of AQIS and IS, but then also the plausible deniability that you made, because these Deobandi groups are constantly breaking apart. So one day you could be a part of Lashkar-e-Jungvi, tomorrow you can be a part of the Pak Talib, and 6 months later you can go to Kandahar and fight with your fellow Deobandis with the Taliban. So they do give Pakistan much more plausible deniability, which, by the way, in the previous panel, that's exactly why Jaish claimed it, because the argument I made was this was done on purpose. They wanted Modi to be reelected.
Okay, on that very provocative clause, yeah, Shekhar.
Can I have 2 questions? One, I understand Pakistan putting Jaish in front. So, and good that many of you or many of us anticipated that Jaish was going to become the preeminent group. Now, is this view correct, which I tend to be persuaded by, that the Pakistanis, the deep state, has now figured that there is sufficient internal tension being built within India. And the next big payback to India will not even come in Kashmir. It will come in the manner that Mumbai happened in 92-93, if the same kind of resentment builds up. Second, in the past, say 92-93, even 26/11 attacks, Pakistan was able to get some Indian collaborators, sympathizers, help. In fact, one of those was then recovered by India from Saudi Arabia. He is in an Indian prison. Abu Jundal, was that the name? Yes. So, one, is that calculation now being made in Pakistan? Two, maybe Hilal can say, because you study Indian Islamic politics, what are the prospects of that happening now? And third, do the Pakistanis again calculate that if something like this happens, and maybe most of the key perpetrators are Indian Muslims, India will accept it as an internal mischief, and they will not be a payback for Pakistan. Because I think if they make that calculation, I think they're making a very big mistake and driving us all into a very dangerous situation.
I'm just going to take Max and Hilal's comments together. Max?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I just wonder, I'm going to be slightly contrarian, if we're really just leaping to too sort of hard a conclusion about Pakistan's intentions. I mean, there's a great logical consistency to the narrative that Pakistan cannot break away from its addiction to this kind of behavior. And we know that in the past, Pakistan has lied about its attempt to, curtail this, when it's actually at the same time instrumentalizing these groups. But I mean, I recently met with General Bajwa. He said to my face, and I'll quote him, he said, "We will not allow these goons to roam around and dictate our foreign policy." Now, do I believe him or not? I don't know if I believe him or not. But I think, I just wonder if we're by giving them no benefit of the doubt at all, one is just setting India towards a course of perpetuating the same miseries. I mean, is it worth at least exploring this issue? By the way, General Bajwa also said, since I can quote him, which gives perhaps a better indication of his real way of thinking. I don't know if that's true, but talking about the nuclear blackmail that you also mentioned in your book, he says, who would lose more in a collision if their economy is bigger, pointing to India? They're a Mercedes and we're a motorbike. So one wonders if he really wants to drive his motorbike into the Mercedes.
So I'll just add a statement to that and then get Hilal. Has Pakistan then, by using proxies like the Lashkar, managed to keep India locked down into a perennial state of conflict response? And therefore, even if you take Shekhar's template, that every time there is a terror strike, there will be some sort of militaristic response, what is that changing? What is that effectively changing if it doesn't shut down groups like the Lashkar? So just park that, Hilal, quickly add, and I think we'll have to just take last comments from Christine and open it up for the audience.
One of the finest point which is made in the book is about the survival of two-nation theory. And coming back to what you asked about Indian Muslim, we have a tendency to think of them as a homogeneous one community. So that's the reason why Manmohan Singh can say that there is no one in terrorist group in 2005. And by same logic, Vajpayee ji would say that there is terrorism, there is Islam or something like that. So I think we need to deconstruct that imagination, and therefore this is very important to locate that the survival of two-nation theory is very different from what we saw in Pakistan. In India, it was there in the name of Akhand Bharat in the 50s and 60s. It translated differently in 90s, and now this is surviving in a very different mode. Somehow we are not paying close intellectual attention to this thing, that two-nation theory is still surviving in India in the name of Hinduism. Not Hinduism, Hindutva. So therefore, this clear polarization is happening, and this is something which this will contribute to Pakistan's imagination of two-nation theory. So that is something which is, which is complementing each other in a way. So that's partly my response to your question.
Okay, Christine, quick response.
Can I just ask a follow-up to this?
Yeah.
So following up on this, one, will you describe Lashkar as Islamic jihadists or Pakistani nationalists? That's one. Second, the big threat to India, does it come from an Islamized Pakistan or an Islamizing Talibanized Pakistan, or does it come from the same old Pakistani nationalism as defined by Iqbal, now empowered by these so-called jihadi groups?
All right, first, I am going to take up your conversation with Bajwa. So, the Pakistanis are genius at cultivating us, right? Us meaning गोरे लोग जो उनके साथ गुफ्तगू करते हैं, right? वो सानू बिल्कुल बेवकूफ समझते हैं, right? They do this, and I am speaking from experience. I'll speak very bluntly. The Pakistanis think about us differently than the Indians do. When they engage, they think about who we engage with, right? So I was a choti larki at the Rand Corporation, right? And I'm meeting with President Musharraf. He actually autographed my dog's photo. Now, and we did. And if you go to my home, it's like right there. In fact, one of the first professional meetings I had, I brought my husband to, we were then dating, was a meeting with Musharraf when he signed my dog's picture. And he's like, that's when I decided to marry you. I'm like, okay. I would have thought there were other reasons, like my practice, but no, it was Musharraf signing Oppenheimer's picture. Now, why did he do this? Because he knew that I was working for a 4-star at PACAF, then the head of the Air Force head of the Pacific Command, now the Indo-Pacific Command. He knew that I worked for the Office of the Secretary of Defense, right? And in fact, well, you won't even believe this. You think your Bajwa meeting was fascinating? I had the entire Pakistan Army band serenade me with Below the God. Okay? I was so choti. I was like a junior assistant to the associate moron, right? India wouldn't even take me seriously. I was still called little lady, right? But the Pakistanis, I was meeting, I still can't believe it, right? And they did this because not of who I was, but who I would go back and influence, right? This is what they do. And sir, if you hang out in South Asia for even 10 years, you will understand why. No, Bajwa, I believe, is related to the word Bajwana. Am I wrong? Because he plays us, right? So I've just seen it countless times. I don't even know how to take it seriously anymore. I'll now tell you why Bajwa is completely full of tutty. If we were to take him remotely seriously, we should be able to go to Jamaat al-Dawa's Twitter feed, right? And we should no longer see Punjab police providing these gundas with security. We should go to the Punjab budget and no longer see money given to Murid K, right? But we don't see any of this. And this stuff is completely available. We should not be still seeing these publications, but they're still selling these publications. And I'll tell you, I wish the Indians in uniform and actually the people in the MEA could figure out how to be a Bajwa like the Pakistanis do. Our policy would be completely different. They cultivate us, they lie to us. I've written an entire piece about how they do this. And they do this so that we will have well-placed interlocutors say, well, shouldn't we give them a chance this time? And I've now been studying this place for so long that when I hear this, I have an aneurysm, right? So, no, Bajwa, he is not an individual. He is a member of this institution. And I'll give you a really good example of when an actual individual, that organization goes beyond the pale, they tank him. Who brought Musharraf down wasn't the dudes in the black jacket. Who brought him down was the Corps commanders, because he was doing things that was beyond the pale from the institution. The peace-mongering in Kashmir, absolutely not. They brought him down. And in fact, what Kayani did, as soon as Musharraf was ousted, he undid everything that Musharraf did, right? So if Bajwa goes too far out on the line, Corps commanders are gonna sack him. And so this is actually a really interesting signaling issue, right? Is how do you signal amongst your Corps commanders it's time to sack the chief, right? Especially when the chief starts asking for extensions, right? So the whole other discussion. But no, Bajwa, he plays us, and he is so accurately named. But I just got so excited over that question. Okay, going back to the issue, the prize is communal discord in India. When you see Lashkar's art, if you ever come to my home, I have a whole collection of it. A very common image is that they have a sword being shoved through India like it's a kebab. And they will often have various signage, but it all comes down to, just like we broke the Soviets, and by the way, that's completely wrong, that had nothing to do with it, we will also break India. And so Kashmir is a foot in the door, but the door they want to kick down is ripping this fabric, right? Because that's how they proved, see, we told you so. We told you so. Two-nation theory was right all along. And it's the Pakistanis, you have to, it sounds so crazy, but they crave some kind of confirmation that two-nation theory is real. Because in fact, the two-nation theory, you know, has been beaten really from the beginning when Muslims, didn't want to be a part of Pakistan, right, in the 36, 37 election, when many Muslims didn't go to begin with, they used Bangladesh, and now you actually have more religious freedom in India if you're a Muslim than you are a Pakistani Muslim, because no one's killing you here, right? So what Pakistan craves is some confirmation of the two-nation theory. Because if the two-nation theory is absolutely wrong, then going back to the motorcycle versus the Mercedes, Pakistan is just a useless motorcycle for no reason, right? It's just a failed version of India, right? So all of these things, these questions, I think in a really interesting way, are really interconnected, and especially how, and to your question, what are they? I view them as special operators. Yeah. Whatever they call themselves, I really don't care, because Pakistan has a dilemma, right? It wants to change the status quo, not only with respect to, and I talk about this in my Pak Army book, it wants to change the status quo not only with respect to Kashmir and maps, but it also wants to resist India's rise in the international system. It has an army that can't win wars, and it has nuclear weapons it can't use, and that leaves one thing, nuclear coercion.
Okay. Max, did you want to come in on Bajwa? Okay. It'll set Christine off again, and it's almost lunch. I'm going to
Can I add something to her Pakistani?
We're at lunchtime. Quickly, 5 minutes only.
Pakistani general stories, not my story, but Steve Cohen. Yeah, Steve Cohen wrote a book on the Pakistan Army. It's a landmark book. Zia banned it. Zia banned it, but gave him a visa to come to Pakistan. He came to Pakistan. Zia invited him for dinner. So Steve Cohen asked him, General Saab, you treat me so well, you give me all these gifts and carpets and a sword and this beautiful bejeweled knife, right? But why do you ban my book? He said, because your book is not something that I want Pakistanis to read. So he said, what is objectionable? So he said he identified one sentence in that book, which is generally quite flattering of Pakistan Army. At that sentence is, Pakistan is the finest army in the world that never won a war.
Okay, literally 5 minutes, maybe 2 questions. Anyone? Anyone? Come on. Okay, right at the back. Please stand up so we can see you. Go ahead.
So this might be a bit off topic from the general discussion, but I wanted to...
Just shout out your question. We can hear it.
I wanted to ask you if you could shed some light, Christine, on the Salafism of the entity. What is the point in the past, rather whose era is it that LET wants to take us back to? Who do they consider as the ideological forefathers of Islam in their brand of Salafism?
Okay, can we take one more question before you answer that? If there is one more question, I know it's almost lunchtime, but I'm sure there's a question or two we should have provoked you to thinking. Yes, please. Yes. Mike, sir.
Pakistani nation is almost bankrupt. Who are financing the Lashkar-e-Tayyaba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Hizbul Mujahideen? Are they getting their weapons from within the Pakistan? Are they using Pakistani army weapons, or are they getting from abroad, importing them?
Ashu, you want to add, and then I'll just take, okay. Christine, quick responses, and then we have to close. Yeah.
All right, so if I were to go and answer the first question, we would really be here throughout lunch. I do talk about this in the book, but even within Salafis, there's variation. Like, there are some Salafis who are quietist, and that's the term that they use, which is to say, we don't like how the world works, but we're not going to get involved politically, we're not going to kill people, we're just going to pray for their, basically hopes and prayers, right? What Americans say when we have school shootings. Then you have Salafis who don't believe in violence, but they believe in political participation, right? Then you have Salafis who believe in no violence, but political participation, And then you have, Lashkar, violence, no political participation until the ISI tells us to. So even when people talk about Salafis, there's so much more variation than you can possibly imagine, which is another reason why LET is so much more manipulatable, because it represents a niche, a very small niche, within a very small group. And you had the Deobandi. So the one, I get it. Yeah, it's very important. Deobandism in Pakistan doesn't bear any resemblance to Deobandism here in India. None whatsoever. Deobandism here tends to be pro-state. So when I hear people say, oh, the Deobandis are building madrasas in Kashmir, I'm like, well, that's probably a good thing, because they're very pro-state here, provided that Deobandi, the madrasas being built in Kashmir are Indian Deobandis. All right, so the next question was...
Bankruptcy and who's supplying the...
Yeah, well, okay. There was this horror, there was a series, I forget what it was called, but I like horror. And so there was this television episode, and my husband and I were watching it, and my husband and I, we looked at each other, and we're like, oh my God, that's Pakistan. And basically what the show was, there was this pharmacist, and he liked to kill people, and he liked mushrooms. He liked them a lot. So he would give diabetics deliberately the wrong insulin, so they would go into a coma, and he would then feed their bodies with sugar and saline and grow mushrooms on them. Now, why do I say this is Pakistan? Because the army are those mushrooms, living off of the body politic of Pakistanis. And who's feeding it? The IMF. So go to, why do you think Baj was telling this guy this stuff, right? Because Pakistan needs an IMF bailout. And why does the IMF keep bailing out Pakistan, even though it never meets any of its previous agreements that it itself agrees to? Because Pakistan has, not only does it use nuclear coercion to blow up stuff in India, it uses nuclear coercion so that the IMF won't take its paycheck and go away, right? Pakistan says, shoot me, pay me before I shoot myself, and I'm like, Goli Mardo, let them die, because they won't die, right? And let me just unpack this just for a second. The Pakistanis need this IMF infusion, right? They need, by the way, coalition support funds. We subsidize their investment in tactical nuclear weapons. That's on me, people. Don't blame me. I complained about it all along, as many of you know. But what happens the day the IMF says, no more IMF for you? The Pakistanis will be forced to have a reckoning like India did in 1990, right? This aid is perpetuating this civil-military problem, because this aid is lubricating the kind of friction that would ordinarily arise between people that don't want to live, right, in a Praetorian state and the army. It would force them to have to argue, why is it that we get to take whatever we want of the budget, even though we've never won a war, right? So when you go to Pakistan, you don't see the kind of poverty that many people in India expect. You don't, for so many reasons. But going to your question, it's the IMF, and it's also big, unaccountable, bilateral flows. I think CSF, when historians write about it, they will blame the Americans for the CSF program. On our time and on our dime, we allowed the Pakistanis to invest in the very instruments that they use to continue coercing us.
Okay, I think you have enough food for thought as you enter lunch. Thank you. A big round of applause to our panel. The book is really fascinating. Do please pick up a copy, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Barkha. May I now request Vandana Menon and Priya Sharma to please come up on the stage and felicitate our panelists, please.
Yes, ma'am.
You're all requested to join us for lunch in the foyer area, and the panelists may kindly join us for lunch in Tapti.
Okay, you're going to send me.
I'll message you. Bilal, bye. Back.